Hi again, everybody. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's Law School. And I'm joined once again by my friend and colleague, Professor DiGirolamo, the center's other co-director, for an episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, that's one word, or also on various streaming platforms like Spotify and Android, and also iTunes. So you can find us in a lot of different places. Well, Mark, welcome back. We missed you on our last episode.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed being a listener on the last episode very, very much. It was a wonderful discussion about the nuns and some of your work, and with a couple of new guests. But yes, I'm glad to be back in the speaker's chair.
Yeah, glad to have you back too. Well, our podcast today is going to be a little bit unusual, not completely unusual, but most of the time we focus on cases or issues in the news about law and religion, but we also have a reading society here at St. John's Law School, a Law and Religion Reading Society. And we thought we'd spend this episode talking about the latest couple of pieces that we read for the Reading Society and the discussion we had. And the books, I have to say, were chosen by Professor DiGirolamo. One of them is a book called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which I must say is a book I'd always heard of, but can't say I ever actually read. And also Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue. So we had a really good discussion with the students about this, about the nature of knowledge, about the sort of moral character of knowledge. And that's what we'd like to speak about today. So I think, Mark, I'll begin by turning it over to you and asking you to tell our listeners, and listeners, maybe you knew about this book. I said a second ago I didn't. What's A Canticle for Leibowitz all about?
Sure. So A Canticle is a post-apocalyptic story. It's a novel of science fiction and fantasy.
And when is it written, Mark?
It was written in 1959, so right at the moment where people were really kind of thinking about post-apocalyptic scenarios, as they do from time to time. But it tells the tale of a world of great scientific achievement that had really quite devastating results for humanity. It tells about a nuclear war where millions of people are killed, and that had horrific consequences for those who survived and the offspring of those who survived. So what we did actually in this session was that the novel contains three different stories spanning three different time periods of this world, but we had the students read the first story. The first story is set in the contemporary Southwest. The landscape is a kind of desolate desert, generally populated by bands of nomads who have been genetically deformed by the fallout of the disaster. And right in the middle of the desert sits this abbey, the Abbey of Leibowitz. Leibowitz being one of the great scientists of the age before the devastation, who had later sought sanctuary in the Catholic Church. Sought sanctuary. We'll tell readers and listeners in a second about why. But the church in this story did what it could to preserve these people's lives by making them monks. The idea being that monks would be less likely to be killed off by the angry mobs that remained. So you have this community of monks that exists to preserve knowledge after the devastation. Although we'll talk about just what it is that knowledge is or purports to be in this world.
Right, because the key finding here happens when one of the novice monks accidentally discovers a cache of material that was saved by Leibowitz himself, including some sort of blueprint. And this sets off a major controversy in his order of mind. I got to tell you, listeners, it's a strange story. I really, really have to tell you. And this blueprint sort of sets off a kind of controversy.
Well, that's right, because I think what had happened was that because of the devastation that had been caused by all of the smart set, so to speak, there were these pogroms of smart people that ensued. The people,
the brights, the brights,
exactly. The idea was that people would call themselves "quote unquote" simpletons, and simpleton meant basically the person that rejected all of this, smart guy learning, which had caused all of these terrible, terrible problems. And so, people wanted the smart set, the brights, killed off, and it's really that results in in the monastery and in the church, giving sanctuary to such people. But you're right, Mark. There's the discovery of this blueprint, which is a kind of remnant of the past world, and people don't sort of know what to do with it. They know that it's, at least even the monks, the learned monks, they know that it's a fragment, a piece of something from the past world, but it talks about technical specifications in a language and referencing knowledge that the monks simply don't have any longer. And so the story is sort of what happens to these documents and to the monk who discovers the blueprint, and the painstaking way in which the monk devotes his life to the documents, whose meaning he has no idea about.
Right, he illuminates a manuscript.
He illuminates a manuscript over a long period of time, and eventually the so-called New Rome decides that there are a sufficient number of proofs to canonize the Leibowitz, the blessed Leibowitz, for whom the monastery is named. And part of the proofs actually concern documents that were found by this monk. And so he sets out to Rome, and he barely makes it there. Actually, the bandits along the way end up taking the illuminated manuscript, which he's heartbroken about. But the Pope consoles him that it's a good thing that the illuminated manuscript was so beautiful, because it succeeded in deceiving the bandits not to take the authentic document, the
Right.
blueprint itself. And ultimately, on the way back from this meeting, our monk is killed, and that sort of completes the first story.
Okay, so as I say, it left me scratching my head a little bit. But Mark, you also thought that, I mean, look, I'm just having fun with my colleague. I mean, obviously, it was a very powerful story. It's very well regarded. And Mark, the other book you assigned was Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which I actually had read, gentle listeners. And you think that there's some connection between these two. What was the connection you saw?
Well, there's a and I recognize that these were my selections, and I pushed the boundaries of my good colleagues' literary sort of push the envelope as much as I could. But I recognize that I was doing so.
I'm just listeners. I'm just not a science fiction fan. That's what it kind of comes down to. So please take everything I say with a grain of salt here. But
he's very tolerant.
But what did you see was the connection with MacIntyre?
So MacIntyre, there's a couple of connections. One is a more overt connection, and that is MacIntyre begins his book really with a kind of recounting of the background of A Canticle for Leibowitz that we have described, and he has a very particular purpose in mind. But when you read the first few pages of After Virtue, you realize that he's discussing the story of Leibowitz, right? The first story of Leibowitz. Why is he doing so? Well, he's talking about, and he's trying to describe a world. And of course, for MacIntyre, his interest is in moral theory and moral agreement and disagreement rather than in scientific knowledge. But he's trying to describe a world, which ultimately he claims is our world, that is beset by disagreements because it is because people are relying on and really only have access to fragmentary knowledge about the moral traditions and moral bases from which the arguments about morality that they make are drawn. And so there's a sort of an obvious reference to A Canticle for Leibowitz, but this is the use to which MacIntyre puts the story, while one story is talking about the sort of use and misuse of and the nature really of scientific knowledge. MacIntyre is talking about the use and misuse and nature of moral knowledge.
So Mark, let's talk a little more about that. So what are the problems with having a fragmented understanding of past knowledge when it comes to moral theory, which, as you say, is MacIntyre's basic question?
So I think from MacIntyre's point of view, the problems are that we have that moral disagreement is interminable, that it can, and not just that it sort of goes on and on, but that it can find no resting place, right? No point at which the various participants can find that they've made any, how to put it, progress, or that they've come to any agreement. And that results in moral argument, political argument becoming ever more shrill, ever more a question of just flat assertion and counter assertion, which MacIntyre claims is a result of morality being conceived as as a kind of statement of emotional support or emotional opposition.
So, but Mark, is the analogy that just as the monk, I think his name was Francis in A Canticle for Leibowitz, just as he doesn't really understand the blueprint and how it fits into the wider body of knowledge in Leibowitz's world, so today, when we are making moral arguments, we only look at fragments of the, I guess, the Western tradition that we're a part of, and that's the problem. Is that the analogy that's being made?
I think that's right. Although we can debate about whether it's the Western tradition that's being used, or whether it's individual bits from various pieces of different Western traditions that are being collected. But yeah, I think that's essentially correct. So the idea is that because we're not aware of now, of course, one difference between Canticle and the story that MacIntyre wants to tell is that in Canticle you had an actual destruction of the knowledge, where of course in MacIntyre's story you don't have a kind of a flame deluge or something like that. What you have is different intellectual movements that break apart or splinter what was a kind of, at least in MacIntyre's telling, a unified account of what moral knowledge was about. And over time, as those new strategies are more and more successful, people in contemporary times have less and less access and less knowledge about what the original was all about.
Yeah, it could be that. It could also be, I mean, since we're a law and religion center, we can talk about religious pluralism. As you're talking, I'm thinking, well, okay, one reason for this fragmentation might be that we have lost the whole of the tradition. Another reason might be we now have lots of different traditions which are now entering the jurisdictional space or jurisprudential space. And that itself might be causing some of these difficulties.
I think that's right. And in truth, MacIntyre accounts for this possibility in some of the later chapters. We only assigned one very famous chapter, chapter 14, for the students, but the entire book is an attempt to account for not just a single tradition, but a plurality of traditions, even within, let's say, a Western literature or Western philosophy, which itself accounts for the inability of people within those traditions, unless they recognize that they're within those traditions, to know exactly what it is that they're doing. And I have to say, Mark, some of MacIntyre's thesis I sometimes see in my own students in class, and drove me, at least in part, to try to create a course for them where at least some of the bases for, let's say, arguments about justice or about fairness or about autonomy or about freedom of contract or other kinds of issues that they see frequently arising in their own classes, so that they could make sense, at least a little bit, of where those arguments that they see in legal material so frequently are coming from. Not, of course, the whole of where they're coming from, but one kind of strain or strand or set of ideas within which they might make sense.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about that. We had a really nice discussion with the students who came out on a weeknight during the sort of towards the end of the term to talk about this. And so one thing we talked about was the nature of knowledge, which I know, Mark, is something you're really very interested in pursuing in your future work.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the nice things, Mark, I don't know how you felt about this, that comes out in the Miller book and in Canticle, is that the moral worth of knowledge is actually quite ambiguous in the story. After all, it's the achievement of great knowledge which is ultimately responsible for the devastation of humanity.
Yes, because as I remember in Canticle, in the part that we read, the flame deluge, which has occurred in the past, is described as what happens is the scientists go to the leaders, the princes of the different countries, and say, look, we have this great technology for this wonderful weapon, but you should never use it because it will lead to all kinds of destruction. This is just meant to assure mutually, what is it? Mutually
assured destruction.
Sorry, yes, mutually assured destruction, right? And of course, all the governments think to themselves, well, if we just go first, we can get away with this. And so it's a nice little reflection on the difference between knowledge and actual moral character, right? Or knowledge and wisdom, actually, we talked about among the students.
That's exactly right. And the students made some nice points, actually, that, maybe it's not knowledge itself that is sort of morally ambiguous. It's knowledge in combination with, as you say, human pride or hubris, and that makes knowledge particularly dangerous. And those were some interesting points. But yeah, so I think in Canticle, there's on the other hand, you have what seems to be these monks who, they're not really even sure just what they're doing in preserving these documents that they don't understand, but somehow they know that it's worthwhile. They know that they think, okay, maybe it's not the children of the present generation or those children's children, but with enough time and thousands of years, or maybe tens of thousands of years, the preservation of this knowledge is going to be good, is going to be worthwhile. There will be somebody that will know what to make of it. And so you do see in Miller, I do think this ambivalence of, well, the knowledge on the one hand in combination with the fallen quality of humanity is really quite dangerous and bad. But on the other hand, there's some kind of natural instinct or drive in human beings to want to preserve it and take care of it and be the custodian of knowledge for future generations.
It's interesting, Mark. So I don't know the answer to this question. Maybe so. Was Miller himself a Christian? Because you could look at this in a way as kind of a parody of what Christian monks did. I mean, Christian monks, when they did illuminated manuscripts, they were illuminated manuscripts mostly of the Gospels, right? Whereas this is an illuminated manuscript of a technical blueprint that has nothing to do with human salvation. So was this kind of a parody? Was Miller himself a Christian?
I think I don't know the answer to the second question about whether he was a Christian, but there have been interpretations of the book that actually people aren't quite sure whether this is a kind of a send up or a parody, or whether it actually is somewhat tender and trying to say something true and real, or maybe perhaps both, right? It's part of the charm, I think, of the book that we, the outside readers, we kind of know, looking in, that they don't understand, that they're unable to, that they don't know what. If they really knew what this was, they wouldn't be making illuminated manuscripts of them. But of course, that's a privileged position that perhaps others at the time of the original monks, maybe there's a different society that was sort of looking in on what they were doing, and maybe they had the same kind of attitude. And so this is part of the interpretation of the book. I think that there's a kind of an uncertainty just about what Miller is about. It doesn't kind of hit you over the head with one message or another. There are a couple of possible readings.
Sure. Well, and this is the great thing about literature, or I should say it slightly differently. This is the thing about great literature, that it has all different kinds of interpretations. And this leads to the second question I thought we'd talk about, which is, so we're lawyers, we're law professors, we're not literature professors. And so I asked during the group meeting when we did this last week, or the week before, I guess, I asked, well, how do we cash this out as lawyers and law professors? What is the meaning of all this for us in law today? Because unlike in the case of great literature, law has to have an answer.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good question. And after that, we started talking, Mark, about just what the role of law professors ought to be, right? Whether law professors should be in the business of simply teaching rules, teaching what the law is, or that is to say, conveying this knowledge, right? This information, the complicated information that takes years to understand.
Because of course, law professors are sort of like monks doing illuminations, right? We're looking at Supreme Court opinions.
If only
we're looking at Supreme Court opinions, doing all kinds of wonderful illustrations, and I don't think anyone's going to be having museum exhibitions of law review articles in the future, but we're spending our time commenting on this. But how do you tie this into MacIntyre?
Synthesizers,
so on, right? Correct.
So one question about this is whether it's possible to do this, to do our jobs without also doing the job of how to put it, teaching about, or at least talking about, moral propositions, right? And I think, obviously, to some extent, it's necessary to talk about moral propositions because law is infused with moral considerations. And so any rule that is derived in law, any rule that one comes up with in law is going to ultimately be derived from some kind of moral position, one way or another. But there are sort of ways and ways to do this, right? And the extent to which law professors or lawyers want to incorporate a sort of sense of moral moral guidance or character formation and so on within their own legal practice or within the way they think about law, I think that's probably a contested matter.
Right, but if we're taking MacIntyre to heart, I guess we'd say that unless one has a good grounding in the whole of the body of moral reasoning from which one is drawing, specific conclusions, one's just going to get it wrong, right?
Yeah, well, I think so. MacIntyre has this very famous, or at least somewhat famous, set of examples that he gives where he talks about different positions that one might take, about what justice demands, let's say, with respect to rights of bodily autonomy, as opposed to what justice demands, when it comes to the preservation of human life and so on. And these are arguments, of course, that one hears a lot. Not just those kinds of arguments, but arguments about liberty or equality and so on. And so I think it's true that MacIntyre would say those arguments, you're not going to get very much traction with them, let's say in a law school classroom, unless students have some kind of a shared framework or understanding about where it is that other people are coming from and the arguments that they're making, right? The sort of sources or larger set of principles or the framework, really, within which whatever position they're taking is situated and within which it can be understood.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting too. Our students really pushed back against the claim, and I made this claim in the meeting that, well, it's really not the point of a law school in 21st century America to be trying to inculcate or impart a moral vision. That the job of law professors was to teach students a skill, teach them legal analysis, train them in understanding doctrine, and then kind of leave it to the students themselves to figure out about the moral framework here and whether it was consistent with a moral framework or not. And I said it sort of provocatively, but I was struck that the students really were not comfortable with that. They thought, no, actually, it is a kind of role of professors in law schools to be explaining the moral valence of these doctrines they are discussing.
Yeah, I think I was maybe not surprised, but students had their own examples. For example, many of the students that were in our session were former students of Mark's and mine in our respective classes, and they gave some examples of situations within our respective classes where we did raise moral questions as relevant to the legal issues that are involved. But I mean, I thought that the point that you were making, Mark, was actually a good one. That you don't, at least for me, a professor need not want to sort of inculcate morality in the sense of telling students what to think or how to think about a question from a moral point of view. But it's a different thing to say that the professor ought to raise the questions that implicate moral matters that we talk about all the time, just so they're kind of lifted to the surface and can be identified and thought about separately or distinctively from the doctrine that we're learning.
Right, Mark. I think I would use that word that you just used, that is identify. I think it's certainly appropriate for a law professor to identify the moral questions. But as I said to the students, as a law professor, I have a captive audience, and my job is not to be there to push them to think a certain way on issues which they have every bit as much a right to think about as I do, So, but that's a difference. It's a different from sort of inculcating a captive audience or, identifying moral issues to think about. But just the last thing I want to say is to circle back. If this is correct, or at least if one reading of A Canticle for Leibowitz is correct, and if MacIntyre is correct, given the current state of our society, we're not going to get very far in a kind of consensus moral discussion because we just don't have a consensus on many of these moral issues that find their way into our law.
I think this is a major problem. And I think actually MacIntyre himself is quite pessimistic with respect to the, how to put it, the future of moral discourse, moral and political discourse in the society. But I think I do think while we're not going to certainly not going to solve this problem, so to speak, there may be better and worse ways to go about fixing up holes, let's say, and maybe one of those ways is to more self-consciously do the kind of work of identification that we were just talking about within the context of education. That is that okay, we're not going to inculcate, we're not going to instruct people about what to think. That would be wrong. But the and I think one of the nice examples that MacIntyre uses is the issue of practice. That the more a person comes into a practice, he uses the example of a chess player, that you learn how to be a good chess player by engaging in the particular virtues over a long period of time that make for good chess playing. And so it might be that the same kind of thing could be said for thinking about, whatever the term, whatever the idea might be in law. If you think about mens rea, what is it that makes for, a good mind as well as an evil mind, right? What kinds of moral frameworks do we have for thinking about what makes for a good character and what law ought to be interested in?
Or in contracts, which is one of the subjects I teach, what is good faith in performance? What is a good faith performance? How do you determine that? And I should say also, my view is that the classroom is rather different from one's writing. When one is writing, of course, one should try to figure out the moral valence of what one is writing and describe these things. But that's different from actually being a classroom teacher, at least in my view. I always resented it when I was in school and teachers would get up and sort of pontificate and tell us what the right answer was, because it was always sort of the subtext was, and I, the professor, I'm a great moral sage, right? I don't feel that way. I'm not a moral sage. I don't
either.
And perhaps because of that experience, I've always been very careful in the classroom not to do that kind of thing. Well, look, it was a really great discussion, and I'm glad you chose these books, Mark. I want to say I hope all the listeners understand that it was really good, and I'm grateful to the students. I hope some of them are listening to this podcast because they really helped advance my thinking about these things. So that's it for now. I think our next podcast will probably get back to more bread and butter law and religion issues. But for now, this is Mark Movsesian with my friend and colleague Mark DiGirolamo. This has been another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, and also on streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple iTunes, and also Android, and plenty of others that our student fellows have set up that I don't even know yet. So anyway, we hope you'll listen to the archives. We hope you'll keep listening to these episodes. But for now, that's it. See you next time.